The anime begins with two girls who kiss in front of their classmates. Later, we realize that both girls are of different species, with one being a centaur and the other a demon. After this, the demon named Nozomi gets a little upset and mentions that she shouldn't have kissed her since they were just acting. Himeno, who will be our protagonist, responds that it's in the script for the play that they have to kiss. However, all the students check their scripts and realize that it doesn't say that anywhere. So, Nozomi checks Himeno's script and sees that the kissing part is handwritten, so the protagonist claims that Kameru gave her that script. Therefore, Nozomi finds Kameru and hits him in the face. It's then that we go back in time a bit and learn that Kameru was supposed to be the prince along with the protagonist, which made him very happy because he wanted to be closer to her. However, for being a cheater, the class removed him from the position and gave it to Nozomi. Kameru states that his plan was to be the prince and get a kiss from the protagonist. Consequently, the student council president, Mitama, tells the girls to stop bothering Nozomi because it was just a simple kiss, although it seems that it meant more to Nozomi. After the play ends, the girls go back to their homes. On the way, the protagonist tells Nozomi and Kaioyuko, who is a half-satyr, that she has always played the role of the princess in plays throughout her life. Kaioyuko finds it interesting but suggests it's probably because of her personality. The next day at school, the costume girls appear and give the protagonist her dress, which she puts on and says it feels great. After this, some boys enter the classroom to set up the stage for the play. When the stairs are ready, the protagonist tries them and finds them a bit unstable, so she asks Mitama to reinforce them. Mitama asks a boy named Fujimoto to adjust them better. In this way, everyone continues to work on the play. Finally, Mitama tells them to rehearse again. With everyone ready, some students from other classes approach due to the rumor about the kiss. However, Mitama closes the doors and says there won't be any kiss. They continue rehearsing until it's time for the play. When they get on the stage, everyone starts acting until the romantic part, where we see Nozomi climbing a tower to reach the protagonist. At this point, all the students expect the famous kiss, but what really happens is that the tower collapses. As a result, the protagonist grabs Nozomi in her arms and falls to the ground. Nozomi gives her a kiss on the cheek as a thank you, causing the audience to go wild. Later, some of the students congratulate both of them on their great performance. The next day, the teacher explains to all the students that there have always been beings with more than 4 legs in history. She also explains that there was a time when species differences caused a war, so she advises everyone to be careful with their actions, as it's possible that another war could happen again. While saying all this, 2 men with fox-like ears observe her from outside. Later on, we see Kaioyuko, who is tired from running, asking her friends to wait for her. However, Nozomi responds that they are going too slowly, and she is lazy. On the other hand, the protagonist tells her that her mom and she go running every day to stay in shape because if they gain too much weight, they won't be able to clean themselves properly, which amuses Nozomi, who is amazed to learn that she can clean herself. Therefore, Kaioyuko claims that she doesn't have that problem because she doesn't gain weight despite eating a lot. At this point, the protagonist suggests that she can ride on her back to continue, to which Kaioyuko responds that it would be illegal. So, Nozomi grabs her arm to keep running and make it to school. Later, Kaioyuko asks Himeno how fast she can run, and she replies that she can cover 100 kilometers in 9 seconds. With that said, Himeno starts running to demonstrate, but because she's so fast, she nearly collides with a car. However, she manages to jump over it. Then, the student patrol, led by a girl, tells them to hurry up as it's almost lunchtime. So, Nozomi takes a shortcut with them to get there faster. At the end of the day, all the students check their semester grades, and Nozomi realizes she needs to study more due to her low grade. The next morning, we see Himeno's mom meeting an old friend in a cafe, who asks about Himeno and her father, Gorilla. Himeno's mom responds by telling her to stop meddling in her business. Later, Nozomi enters a store where she sees a fashion magazine with Himeno apparently as the cover model. Just then, Mitsuyo appears and starts teasing Nozomi about how Himeno, as a model, won't have time for her anymore. However, Nozomi ignores her and leaves, but Mitsuyo follows her and mentions that she can turn her into a model. As a result, Nozomi agrees, and they go to Mitsuyo's house, along with Yukai, who is Mitsuyo's girlfriend. While there, Mitsuyo transforms Nozomi and dresses her up like a cosplay character. This annoys Nozomi, who takes off the clothes and decides to leave. Mitsuyo threatens her to make her stay and play with her for a while. The next day, Nozomi asks the protagonist if she's hiding something from her, and the protagonist recalls the day they went to eat donuts, and she returned alone to eat more. However, Kaioyuko shows her the fashion magazine and asks if she she's the cover model. The protagonist confirms that she is but explains that she was just doing a favor for her mom's friend because they couldn't find a centaur model for the magazine. Upon hearing this, Yuko tells her she could probably become a great model. In response, the protagonist explains that she doesn't want that, as her dream is to become a doctor or a veterinarian. But she's afraid that animals might bite her, so she has been considering taking care of and selling fish. Nozomi replies that it's a challenging job because all fish have different care requirements. With that, Yuko suggests that they should also think about their futures. Back at school, Yukai approaches Nozomi and whispers something to her, causing her to stand up and face Mitsuyo, who confesses that she's been working at a cafe. Furthermore, she stands up and hugs the protagonist, expressing her affection for her. The next morning, Yuko confesses to her friends that she can't stand the cold. At this point, we see Mitsuyo getting under Mitama's wings to warm up and taking the opportunity to touch her breasts. However, Mitama hits her on the head and tells Yukai to do something because she's her girlfriend. But Yukai claims she can't do anything. Later, Mitsuyo continues to stay close to Mitama, who explains that angel wings don't provide warmth, and that it's just a myth. On the other hand, Nozomi and Yuko lie on Himeno's back to warm up a bit while they walk. Then, Himeno stops and suggests to Yuko to think about warm summer moments. Yuko starts to remember when they went to the pool with some mermaid girls. On that day, the boys at the pool approached her to ask her out because they weren't used to seeing faces like hers there. Furthermore, one of the mermaids mistook Nozomi for a boy, and even tried to pull down her panties to see what she had until the teacher arrived, and one of the mermaids told everyone to be quiet. Back to the present, Yuko says that was the hottest moment because not everyday boys show interest in her. Just at that moment, a boy stumbles upon them while carrying a mermaid. Upon seeing her, the protagonist mentions that she feels a bit envious because she'd like to be carried like that. On the other hand, the mermaid tells the boy that she wishes she could be a centaur to walk. In this, some girls appear and start criticizing the boy for having to carry her. Then, they leave, claiming he only does it because she's pretty and has big breasts. Later, the mermaid looks at an invention that allows mermaids to walk with robotic legs. However, the boy tells her it's too expensive. The next day, we find the protagonist playing with her little cousin Shino, who loves being with her, while Midoriko, her mom, talks with Himeno's mother. Then, she goes to the room with Shino to read her a book, but since she keeps sweating, they decide to go buy ice cream. Subsequently, they encounter Mitama and her three little sisters, who are all identical. Seeing them, they approach the protagonist and give her a kiss, which upsets Shino, who pushes them away and says the protagonist is only hers. Then, they all go to the park to enjoy their ice cream. Mitama's younger sisters start telling that their older sister always gives them 4 kisses a day. Additionally, they ask Mitama if she kisses the protagonist, to which she replies no, as when girls grow up, they can't kiss each other. Just then, Mitsuyo and her girlfriend appear, and the girls ask her if it's true that girls don't kiss. In response, Mitsuyo holds Yukai and kisses her, causing Mitama to get angry and hit her on the head, saying she shouldn't do that in front of her little sisters. Therefore, she explains to the girls that she can only kiss someone on the mouth who is very special to her but can give a cheek kiss to anyone. With that, she approaches Mitama and gives her a kiss, making her blush. She also approaches the protagonist, but Shino stops her, so she tries to kiss her. However, Mitama hits her again. Having done that, Mitsuyo says goodbye with her girlfriend. Later, the girls start chasing Shino to try to kiss her, so she runs away until the 4 of them end up playing in a water fountain. Therefore, the protagonist and Mitama catch them and say goodbye. Upon arriving home, Himeno's mom tells both of them that they can use the shower to finish bathing. Consequently, they both take a bath. Upon finishing, Shino confesses to Himeno that she couldn't understand what the girls were saying in the park, to which she replies that she'll understand when she's older. Later, the protagonist puts Shino in her aunt's car and says goodbye to her. The next day, we see Mitama's little sisters playing with their younger sister, Sue. Then, Mitama tells the 3 of them to stay home while she goes to school. She also asks them to take good care of Sue because their dad is working, and no one can stay with, so they agree but call some friends to come to the house to play with. Having done that, Mitama goes to school where she meets Himeno and wishes her luck with her student group. Meanwhile, Mitama's little sisters play hide and seek with their friends until one of them finds Sue, who runs away but ends up falling to the ground, so they stop playing and lay Sue down in her bed, saying she always gets tired when she runs too much. Therefore, they all decide to play inside the house so as not to leave Sue alone. On the other hand, Mitama concludes the student council meeting and asks everyone to cast their votes. However, some become upset and claim they need more time to make a decision. Nevertheless, she tells them it's time to choose, to which one of the girls responds that all she wants is to go home. So, Mitama confirms that it's true because she needs to be with her little sisters at 4 in the afternoon. mood. As a result, everyone decides to vote. Later, as they leave the room, one of the students approaches Mitama and tells her that if she's late coming home one day, nothing bad will happen to her sister. But she responds that ever since her grandfather passed away, her family is the most important thing in her life. With that said, she goes to the supermarket where she buys some treats for her sisters and friends, while Sue plays house with one of the girls. Later, Mitama enters her house and feeds everyone. However, one of her sisters notices that one of her friends is apparently missing. Afterward, the girls say goodbye, and their father arrives, learning what happened and explaining that there was probably a friendly ghost playing with them, unlike the evil spirits. The next morning, as the protagonist and her friends are on the train to school, a boy approaches her and tries to give her a letter, mentioning that he fell in love with her at first sight. However, the protagonist just stares at him and eventually runs away without saying anything. Her friends follow her and ask why she didn't accept the letter. However, Hyuno doesn't respond and continues walking until they reach school. Later, Nozomi continues asking her the same thing all morning, without getting a response from the protagonist. Nevertheless, she doesn't give up, so she accompanies her to her house along with Kaioyuko, who also wants to know why she left the guy with the letter in his hand. Therefore, Hyuno starts by affirming that she is afraid, and this leads the others to draw conclusions, saying that she is surely afraid of the sexual aspect or of getting pregnant. But she tells them that when she was a child and was on a farm watching cows eat with her classmates, one of the boys told her that her private parts were surely like a cow's, and that her breasts would be large when she grew up. This caused the protagonist to start crying. Furthermore, she confesses that since that day, she's been afraid of boys seeing her, so much so that she hasn't even seen herself there. Therefore, Nozomi suggests that the three of them expose themselves to each other so that she doesn't feel more ashamed of herself. With that said, Nozomi lifts her skirt so they can see her properly. Then, when it's Kaioyuko's turn, she tries to escape, but Nozomi stops her until she shows herself to both of them. Finally, Hyuno does the same and lets her friends see, who affirm that she looks very beautiful. In addition, Nozomi takes a picture for her to see herself. As a result, Hyuno states that she feels better. The next day, she accepts the guy's letter and goes to school very happy, where she opens the envelope and reads the letter, although apparently it wasn't what she expected. So, the next day, she encounters the guy on the train again and runs away, telling him she can't. Her friends follow her and ask her why she ran away again, to which she explains that in the letter, the guy told her that he only liked her physical appearance. As Sunday arrived, the girls gathered to help Nozomi study. However, Kaioyuko scolded her because instead of studying, she was reading manga. She also used the protagonist's legs as a pillow while Kaioyuko continued to reprimand her, reminding her that if she failed again, she wouldn't be able to advance to the next year. But as she didn't react, the protagonist held her by the arms while Kaioyuko explained everything she needed to learn. Then, they gave her some chocolate to boost her energy. However, she lay back on Hyuno's legs until Hyuno mentioned that if she failed, she wouldn't be able to attend classes with her or go on excursions together. Upon hearing this, Nozomi got up determined and began to study with all her energy until she suddenly saw a UFO. However, as her friends didn't see it, they started saying it was a lie. Additionally, Kaioyuko began explaining that if extraterrestrials existed, they would have already contacted humans. She also mentioned that there was a town called Azteca where a snake god had driven all the people out, and they were never seen again. With that, Nozomi got up to look out the window, but the protagonist told her to rest a bit and focus on studying. The next day, Nozomi stared at the sky, so Kaioyuko jokingly asked her if she had found a UFO. Upon arriving at school, the protagonist bumped into a pole because she was paying attention to Nozomi. Kaioyuko then told them that something strange was about to happen because there was a lot of government security at the school. Subsequently, the girls approached a security guard and asked him what was going on, to which he replied that they would soon find out. Later, as they entered the classroom, they found a new desk, so they thought it was because of a new student. This turned out to be true when the teacher introduced the new student named Quetzalcoatl, who happened to be a snake. Upon seeing her, the protagonist felt somewhat uncomfortable and couldn't stop looking at her. To make matters worse, the teacher asked her to show Quetzalcoatl around the school. At the beginning of the class, the teacher established order while Quetzalcoatl, for some reason, showed her enormous throat to the protagonist, who immediately fainted. Later, she woke up in the infirmary, with her two friends comforting her and asking why she had fainted. She confessed that she was afraid of snakes because she had watched a movie with her parents when she was little, in which a large snake ate the protagonist, who was a centaur like her. Hearing this, Yuko recommended that she watch the movie again to overcome her fear, as the effects in the movie weren't very convincing. At that moment, Shizutoki, the guard, entered and asked the protagonist if she was feeling better, to which she affirmed that she was. Subsequently, Quetzalcoatl came in and apologized to the protagonist, mentioning that she was just trying to smile, which seemed terrifying to Nozomi and Yuko. However, Nozomi explained to her that the protagonist had fainted due to a movie with a snake and centaurs. So, they decided to watch the movie together. They arrived at a room and introduced themselves to some other girls. Then, Nozomi found the movie in a box and played it on the TV. During the scary scenes, the protagonist ended up hugging Quetzalcoatl, who also felt frightened by what was happening. In the end, Quetzalcoatl explained to the girls that she wasn't like the monster in the movie because her species didn't have teeth to devour people, nor could they swallow a human whole. Upon hearing this, the protagonist calmed down a bit and told her that they could be friends, to which Quetzalcoatl smiled, causing the protagonist to faint again. Later, all the students gathered around Quetzalcoatl to ask her questions, so Mitama intervened and told them to ask in an orderly manner. First, a boy asked how her species survived in Antarctica with the cold. She explained that her species was different from regular snakes and where she lived, it was actually warm. Next, a girl asked if her species wanted to control humans. Quetzalcoatl replied that they couldn't because they had never had contact with humans in the past, and the connection between the two species was just beginning. Then, the same girl asked if her species had influenced the Aztecs. Quetzalcoatl explained that they had shared ideas and knowledge with them but had never interfered in political matters. Subsequently, another girl asked why she had chosen to study at that school. Quetzalcoatl explained that her purpose was to meet intelligent people and learn from. Finally, another waifu asks her if she has a boyfriend, to which she responds with a resounding no. However, the girl asks her what kind of guys she likes. But then, Quetzalcoatl makes it clear that her species doesn't show romantic interest in anyone. With that, Mitama affirms that the question time is over and instructs everyone to take their seats. That night, Quetzalcoatl watches TV and realizes that a UFO crashed into a ship. The next day, the protagonist and her friends meet Quetzalcoatl, who says she's trying to lay low because of what happened. Nozomi reassures her that it's not her fault or her species' fault. Consequently, the protagonist suggests they go shopping for some clothes. In the store, Quetzalcoatl tries on various dresses with Nozomi, who doesn't like them much. Then, they go out for ice cream, while Quetzalcoatl comments that despite what happened, everyone is still treating her nicely. Afterward, they go to the cinema, and when it's over, Quetzalcoatl thanks the girls for spending the day with her. The next morning, the protagonist gets up and gets dressed for school, but before leaving, she goes to the bathroom to take care of business. However, her mother rushes her, saying she can finish at school. She explains that the school toilets are uncomfortable for her. When she arrives at school, her friends comment that her hair is very long. She explains that she hasn't been able to cut it because it's not so easy for her species. Nozomi suggests she should have the same hairstyle as her. However, Mitsuyo and her girlfriend suggest Himeno should have princess-like hairstyles and leave her hair long with some braids. The protagonist mentions her idea is to cut it to shoulder length, as some people didn't like it when she cut it very short ones, like Shino, who said she didn't look like a princess anymore. At that moment, Mitama appears and says that such things tend to happen, as her little sisters told her something similar in the past. With that, Quetzalcoatl asks Himeno if she also plans to cut her tail a little, to which she responds that the hair in that area falls out on its own. Later, the protagonist unpacks her lunch, but when she notices her mother has packed a lot of vegetables, she says she's on a diet. Quetzalcoatl mentions she has adjusted her stomach for human food, but she can't eat things she can't chew with her teeth. Yuko takes out a chocolate bar to tempt Himeno, who is scolded by Mitama for bringing snacks from elsewhere to school. Later, Yuko starts doing a hairstyle for the protagonist while she tells them that when she was younger, a teacher scolded her, thinking her hair color was artificial, and that's why they decided to imprison it. The protagonist begins to tell a story about her family lineage, involving a red-haired princess who was kidnapped by a king and his army. Her family had to fight a great war to rescue her. Hearing this, Quetzalcoatl is surprised, while Nozomi doesn't believe it all. Moving on, we find Yuko calling an office worker and telling him that she will soon deliver the work her father is writing, as he constantly writes while she just organizes it. On the other hand, the office worker tells his boss that the daughter of one of their workers just called and thanks to Yuko, her father submits his work on time. Back with Yuko and her father, Yuko peers out the window and notices Mitama, who is wearing a strange robe and enters her neighbor's house. Later, the woman tells Mitama that she has a cursed box that terrifies her and gives her nightmares. Mitama asks her to leave the room while she takes care care of everything. With that, the woman exits while Mitama makes some noises, pretending to have supernatural powers. Finishing up, the woman pays her and leaves. On the other hand, Kaioyuko prepares some coffee for her father and mentions that her brother will come to dinner with. Later, Mitama arrives at her house and finds her father cooking while her sisters are asleep. She tells her father that he can continue with his painting, and he responds that he's a little tired but wants to help with dinner. She replies that he can be a good father and a good painter if he sets his mind to it. At this point, her younger sisters wake up, and they all get ready for dinner. On the other hand, the protagonist falls asleep while her mother remarks that she's still a child. Meanwhile, Nozomi finishes her karate classes, and before closing the dojo, a woman thanks her for teaching her daughter. Next, we see Quetzalcoatl reading some girls' magazines to learn more about humans. When the weekend comes, Mitama and her sisters meet Quetzalcoatl and her friends. Seeing her, the triplet girls begin to say that she's a dinosaur. However, Mitama explains that's not true and that Quetzalcoatl comes from Antarctica. Consequently, the little girls tell Quetzalcoatl to open her mouth so they can play with her. However, Mitama orders them to stay still and go to the pool instead. So, they all put on their swimsuits. In this moment, Nozomi and Kaioyuko mention to Quetzalcoatl that they thought her species had breasts, to which she responds that they have no one to breastfeed. With that said, everyone gets into the pool to have fun. Quetzalcoatl admits that she's scared to enter the water because in Antarctica, those who enter the water have died. However, Nozomi explains that the pool is shallow, and she can get in without any problem. Just then, the triplet girls grab Quetzalcoatl's hand and force her into the pool. Later, Shino becomes friends with Sue, seeing how cute she is. She tells Hymno that she wants to swim but can't do it in that pool. So, the protagonist takes her along with her friends to the adult pool. Seeing this, the triplet girls try to follow them, but Mitama stops them and says they can't leave Sue alone. On the other hand, Nozomi and Kaioyuko start swimming while the protagonist teaches Shino. After they're done, they return to Mitama and her sisters, who refuse to play with Shino, saying she can go to the adult pool. However, Shino starts splashing water at them, and they all end up playing together. Later, they decide to get something to drink, causing the girls to become sleepy. However, Mitama tells her sisters they can't sleep because she can't carry all of them. So, Nozomi and the others take care of them and offer to take them home, even though Mitama mentions that their home is far away. The next day, a boy enters the protagonist's classroom, saying he wants to tell ghost stories, which she doesn't find very appealing. However, both she and her friends end up helping the boy because he tells them he wants to get closer to President Tawako and save the occultism group. He claims that if they present the stories, the school might give them a room just for them. Nozomi doesn't seem very convinced. However, the protagonist agrees, which delights the boy so much that he ends up hugging her and putting his face on her chest. This upsets Nozomi, who hits him on the head, but she eventually agrees to help. That night, everyone returns to school to tell their ghost stories, accompanied by President Tawako. Upon entering, they form a circle, and the boy lights some candles to create a spooky atmosphere. First, Kaioyuko starts telling her story, which scares Nozomi and the protagonist. However, Tawako claims that those urban legends don't scare her. Next, Quetzalcoatl begins to tell her story, mentioning that her species doesn't believe in the supernatural, but she recalls a mysterious incident from her childhood when a slab fell into a well for no apparent reason. Later, the girls start discussing science, and the boy interrupts to share a story about a friend who saw a rainbow animal, which is a rare creature that apparently went extinct a long time ago. Afterward, the boy blows out the candle and tries to scare the girls with a terrifying expression, claiming that his friend saw the ghost of the rainbow animal. This once again frightens the protagonist and the others, except for Tawako and Kaioyuko, who turns on the lights and says the boy was just trying to scare them with his expression. The next day, we see Hymno practicing for her archery tournament, focusing on shooting arrows at a target. While she does that, her friends watch her and scold her when she misses an arrow. She tells them she's a bit distracted. At that moment, Ayaka, another girl from the school, appears and shoots an arrow, scaring the protagonist, who tells her she can't shoot with her around. Then she introduces her to her friends and tells them that Ayaka is her competitor and friend. However, this is not how Ayaka sees it, and she responds that she will beat her in the competition as revenge for last year. With that said, Ayaka leaves, telling the girls to cheer on the protagonist because she'll need motivation to win. Later, Hymno tells her friends that she defeated Ayaka in the last tournament and tries to cheer her up by making funny faces, which has made Ayaka determined to beat her since that day. However, Nozomi and Kaioyuko believe that Ayaka might actually want to be friends with Hymno, so Kaioyuko whispers some advice to the protagonist on how to befriend her. However, their coach interrupts and orders the protagonist protagonist to return to training. When they finish, the protagonist thanks the girls for accompanying her. She confesses that she practices this sport for her mother, as her grandfather always wanted her to do it. Yuko adds that centaurs have been practicing this sport for a long time with the goal of finding a partner. However, the protagonist makes it clear that she's not thinking about that, but she wonders why Ayaka is, as she's not of marriageable age yet. The next day, Quetzalcoatl and the others arrive at the archery tournament, where they meet Hymeneal and Shino's parents, with Shino accompanied by her friend Rei, who thinks that Quetzalcoatl is a monster. Later, everyone takes their seats to watch and cheer for the protagonist. When Hymeneal's turn comes, she begins to run and shoots her arrows, scoring well. Then, when it's Ayaka's turn, she mentions what Yuko told her about making a bet with Ayaka, so Ayaka agrees to it, although she gets a bit distracted because the protagonist tells her that if she loses, they'll go on a date. However, Ayaka decides to concentrate and ends up winning the tournament. As a result, the following day, Ayaka and the protagonist have their date. Ayaka takes her to the places she wants to visit while Nozomi and the others hide to watch them. On the other hand, the mermaid school is preparing for a big festival, but two boys are looking at a magazine where other species are in swimsuits instead of helping. Two mermaids are annoyed by this and mention that they see mermaids' breasts every day, which should be enough for them. However, the boys respond that they've gotten used to mermaids' breasts, so it doesn't excite them as much as before. At this point, Iri, another mermaid, appears and catches the boys' attention with her breasts. She feels somewhat harassed, so she runs away. The boys then tell the other mermaids that Iri's breasts have grown a bit more. Later, Iri goes to a mountain, where a man lights torches to begin the festival. He explains to Iri that she has to sing to the god Tego to bless the sea and make the festival a success. Iri starts singing, and some dolphins appear. The man claims that this is a sign that Tego is enjoying the song. However, suddenly, everything changes, and the dolphins flee. A giant frog-like creature emerges from the sea, claiming to be Tego. However, the man realizes it's an imposter and runs away with Iri. Afterward, Iri asks if he's sure that the frog isn't their god, and the man tells her that Tego is not a living god. They decide to go to the shore and report what happened to the Coast Guard. On the other hand, the protagonist and her friends ask Mitama what she thinks about gods. After thinking for a while, she affirms that they exist and are very good. Later, we see Sue playing with a friend. However, when her father sees her, he realizes that Sue is playing alone, even though she claims to have a friend. A few days later, we find Hymeneal in her classroom with her new phone, where she plays a video where a giant frog appears promoting medicine. Seeing this, Quetzalcoatl explains to the girls that the frog's name is Jean. She tells them that Jean was rescued by the French, who took care of him and taught him many things. Jean was able to enter university and graduate with the highest grades in the class. After this, Quetzalcoatl goes on to say that thanks to that, Jean was able to become the president of a large company, and for this reason, he has been appearing in commercials for some time now. Following this, Mitama appears and tells them that Jean is going to school, and she wants to organize a welcome for him, so the girls decide to help her. On the other hand, we move to a large company where the boss stands up to greet Jean, who greets him by taking off his glove. Then, Jean explains his business plan, which convinces the man, who bids him farewell at the end of the meeting. Afterward, Jean's secretary mentions that he'll have to hurry up to meet all his commitments because he took so long explaining his business. Therefore, he boards his private plane, where he changes into different clothes for a meeting with his kind. Later, he gets on a helicopter, which takes him to his destination in the middle of the jungle. When he arrives there, his relatives start receiving him. However, one of them advises not to hug him with dirty hands. Later on, Jean meets with the village chiefs, who seem to be upset with the other mammals. So he tells them that they must maintain peace with everyone because if they rebel, they will be the ones destroyed. Nevertheless, one of them accuses him of spending too much time with other species. He also tells Jean that they are being deceived and should join them to reclaim the land and water that their supposed friends have taken from them. However, Jean decides to remain silent. The next day, Jean gives his speech at the protagonist's school. After finishing, Mitama and the girls prepare tea for him and serve it. However, when Jean tastes it, he ends up vomiting due to the taste. Furthermore, we find ourselves in a memory of the head of the large company, who remembers how he, as a child, found himself in the midst of the First Species War, where the centaurs enslaved various species after killing many. During that time, the boss was taken to a labor camp where soldiers would beat him, as well as another slave who was also a centaur. When it was time to eat, the other species, including the boss, had to eat very little, unlike the centaurs. So they tried to protest, but they couldn't do anything against the soldiers. As a result, they all became very weak. One night, while trying to sleep, the other species began to beat the centaur. However, the boss tried to defend him, but the others beat him as well. At this point, a demon man explained to him that despite their efforts, discrimination would always exist on Earth because with different races, others would envy each other. With this said, the soldiers entered the place to stop the fight. The next day, the boss fainted due to hunger, so the centaur took him to a barn where he fed him while pretending to beat him. Several months later, the day came when the soldiers' base was attacked by a rescue group, which was successful in liberating all the species. At this point, the boss, who was still a child, entered the barn and found the centaur who had helped him hanging from the ceiling, while the other species enjoyed watching. After this, the boss ran away because they also wanted to hang him. However, a soldier ended up defending him and gave him something to eat. Right at this moment, the boss is interrupted from his memory by his secretary, who informs him that Jean has arrived. This is when we understand why the boss accepted Jean's handshake without gloves. After a few days, Quetzalcoatl manages to have a date with a guy who invites her to an art museum, so the protagonist and her friends decide to follow them to see what happens, while those in charge of Quetzalcoatl also follow them. When they arrive at the museum, the guy shows Quetzalcoatl some paintings and tells her a bit about human works and how photography has evolved throughout history thanks to cameras. Then, they go to a cafe, so the girls continue to follow them. While they are there, the guy asks Quetzalcoatl if there is art in Antarctica, to which she tells him there isn't much. Having said that, they return to the museum, so the protagonist and her friends follow them until she accidentally collides with a guy named Makoto, who is holding Mitama's arm. She quickly releases his arm to avoid arousing suspicion in front of Hymno. Later on, Quetzalcoatl and the guy leave the museum and head to a hotel, which worries the security chief who doesn't know what to do in such a situation. But in the end, everything calms down as the guy overlooks the hotel and takes Quetzalcoatl to a library. The next day, the girls ask her how her date went, and Quetzalcoatl tells them that they went to the museum, but she didn't understand much about the art. The protagonist then affirms that she didn't understand it either, so Nozomi and Kaioyuko ask her to be quiet before they get caught. On the other hand, Makoto approaches Mitama and invites her to go out. Later, he arrives at his house, where the triplets complain to Mitama for leaving them alone. However, she asks them to behave and goes with Makoto. It is then that we understand why both of them had their arms crossed, because they decide to do so when a guy complains to his girlfriend for not holding his arm. On the same day, they accidentally run into the protagonist at the museum while talking about art because Mitama has a desire to learn from her father. Meanwhile, one of her little sisters poses with her stuffed animal for her father, who paints her in a large painting. However, she gets tired of sitting and decides to go play with Sue. Back with Makoto and Mitama, they go to a cafe, where he buys chocolates for the triplets and gives them to Mitama, mentioning that she should give them to her sisters so they don't hate him. Subsequently, they sit down and continue to talk about art. In addition, Mitama tells him about the paintings her father creates. Finally, she thanks Makoto for being with her and says goodbye, stating that she needs to go back home for dinner. Upon arrival, her little sisters greet her with joy, especially Sue, who always jumps into her arms. Later, Mitama tells her father it's time for dinner and that he shouldn't overindulge in his paintings, so he stops painting. Back to the present, we see the girls in the classroom, where Mitama continues to talk to Makoto and thanks him again. The next day, Mitama tells the triplets to look after Sue, and they tell her about an occasion when a dog kidnapped her and they had to intervene to rescue her. They also confess that on another occasion, the neighbor's son took Sue without them noticing. Mitama realizes that's why the neighbor greets her every day. After this, Mitama asks her sisters to take care of Sue and not lose sight of her. On the other hand, the protagonist and Shino go for a walk. Shino becomes curious about the herbs she sees on the way, so Hymno starts explaining the different types of herbs and flowers that exist. Later, Shino explains to her classmates about the flowers thanks to the teaching she received from Hymno. Then, they start playing with the figures, even though they don't understand all of them very well. Later on, Shino continues to show the girls that each flower has its name. She also points out the differences between them, which astonishes. The next day, one of the girls tries to explain to her teacher about the flowers, but the teacher doesn't pay much attention. This leads to the girl crying until Shino calms her down. In the evening, the protagonist teaches Shino about the figures. On the other hand, we see Sue, who realizes that her tail is growing, so her sisters see it and tell her that they will teach her how to move her tail. One of them shows her some movements for her to copy, but some are extremely difficult, making Sue feel a bit uncomfortable. After this, Mitama appears and shows them the family album, where she appears with a small tail. Sue feels a bit better, However, while her sisters explain that to show their tails, they need to wear a skirt with a hole, as dresses and pants don't display them well. Finally, Mitama takes them to eat. The next day, the triplets try to build a tower with the three of them, but they end up falling, so their teacher tells them to be careful. Later, the three of them, along with Sue, go to the park, where they meet the protagonist and her friends. When they see them, they become happy and start playing with them. On one side, Himeno holds one of them in Shino, which makes the other feel a bit jealous. Meanwhile, Nozomi grabs another of the triplets and starts spinning around with her. Then, they return home, where they are welcomed by Mitama, who tells them that it's late, and she was about to go look for them. The little ones affirm that they haven't found a sister more beautiful than her, to which Mitama replies that Sue has become the most beautiful. Later, we jump to a scene where the girls are participating in a fantasy RPG stage. They enter a labyrinth wearing combat attire and armor. In this, a giant monster appears while Nozomi stays on the protagonist's back, telling her to shoot the monster. However, she states that it would be wrong to do so. Nevertheless, when the monster gets very close, she decides to shoot an arrow but misses. After this, Nozomi takes her sword and starts fighting it, while Kaioyuko prepares a spell, and Quetzalcoatl does a victory dance. When ready, Kaioyuko summons a fireball and hurls it at the monster. Seeing it, the monster tries to catch it but ends up causing an explosion that turns it into ashes, giving the girls 2 gold coins. Subsequently, the girls continue walking through the labyrinth until they encounter some skeletons that try to attack, so the protagonist takes her bow and takes them down with her arrows. However, some ghosts approach them, and Nozomi tries to confront them with her sword, but as she can't hurt them, Quetzalcoatl intervenes and uses the language of the gods to make them disappear, stating that in Antarctica, she was a priestess. They continue their journey, and the protagonist complains about her clothes, to which Nozomi tells her that it's swimwear and to stop complaining. At this point, a green slime-like creature starts to approach them slowly until Himeno steps on it. Immediately, the slime falls on all of them except Kaioyuko, who dodges it quickly. Therefore, Nozomi asks Kaioyuko to cast a spell to save them. However, Kaioyuko explains that the slime won't harm them, it just wants to play with them and put them in sexy positions. And that's precisely what happens. So Quetzalcoatl tells Kaioyuko to use some salt water to free them. She follows her advice and uses one of her spells to stop the slime and free the girls, who end up almost naked. After this, they enter where the final boss is, who turns out to be Mitama dressed as a queen. She tells the girls that if they want to exit the labyrinth, they must discover her secret, to which Kaioyuko says her secret is that she stuffs her chest. This causes Mitama to run away in embarrassment. In this way, the labyrinth falls apart, and that's how the story ends, written by Mitsuyo herself, who is questioned by Nozomi, who mentions that a bikini armor would be of no use. Later on, all the students organize a championship to find out who is the strongest in the class. This is when Mitama demonstrates her strength against one of her classmates, stating that she always trains with her sisters. Next, it's Quetzalcoatl's turn, who also loses because she's too busy staring at her opponent. Following that, the protagonist faces Fuku but lets her win easily, so the girls tell her to take it seriously, and if she loses, they'll check if her chest is real. Therefore, they compete again, and the protagonist quickly emerges victorious. After that, Kaioyuko competes, but she loses against another girl who is just as weak as her. Then, Nozomi faces Aruka, who, despite being very intelligent, has no physical strength, so she's defeated. And so, the competitions continue until they reach the semifinals. In these, Nozomi faces Mitama in a tough match where Nozomi seems to have the upper hand at first, but in the end, Mitama gives it her all and defeats her. Finally, the protagonist faces Inukai, whom she thought she could beat, but in the end, Himeno easily wins. Reaching the final, Mitama tells the protagonist that she has no intention of losing. As the match begins, Mitama puts up a fight against the protagonist, who seems to never tire. As a result, she defeats Mitama and confesses that carrying Shino has helped her build strength in her arms. And that's how the first season of this anime ends. If you've reached this part of the video, let me tell you that you've been one of the few people to make it this far, so comment the word centaur in the comments. Remember to subscribe to not miss any videos. With that said, see you in the next video.